This video is regarding an exercise on figure invention, something that all illustrators and storyboard artists, concept artists, and many other types of artists are going to need in their daily practice. It's going to require 3D space and the knowledge of 3D space, as you're seeing here with this mannequin of the human form, recognizing it in basic shapes and recognizing the XYZ axes of those shapes in 3D space. Now, let's get on with the exercise. So every drawing begins with a point of reference, and here I took this point of reference from Wikipedia. This is an image on parkour. I'm taking the second of the 3 steps here, and I'm practicing that. So I'm building out with primitives in mind. I'm starting with what would be called the mannequin. The head starts off as an oval. It is then massaged into a shape that is recognizable as a skull with the 3 points, forehead, chin, and the back of the skull as the 3 particular points of concern. Then moving on to the body as a pillow shape, and then the arms and the legs as simple cylinders with hands and feet, which are just primitive shapes, and those primitive shapes are nothing more than a recognizable space for where all the fingers are going to fit into eventually. And the idea with this first round is to exercise what's going on here. Practice attempting to find the weight, the gravity, the overlap, the dimensionality of the pose. So the key things here now will be the draw through part of this. Not so much that I put details into it, but that I recognize, like right now, the tilt of the shoulders and where the head is in position in between those 2 shoulders, recognizing the tilt of the head, that it isn't actually straight out in front, but it is looking downward, and that extends the chin even farther. I'm looking for the volumes, the contours or the cross contours of the body, using cross contour lines, those little ellipse lines that I'll be wrapping around these forms. I'm looking for the corners, any corner, elbow, knee. I'm looking for the pelvis, the dimples of the sacrum as I just drew in. Those are all recognizable landmarks on the body, knowing where those landmarks are in relationship to each other in pitch and tilt. So that would be the up and down from the left and right to each other. That helps me recognize the elevation of things so that when I get involved in the next step, I understand clearly where to put things, or at least I have a good understanding of where they're supposed to go. That way, once I start sketching them out, I get closer to my target than just sitting there trying to put something down and erasing it and putting something down until eventually I arrive at a conclusion. So here I'm putting the last few elliptical lines around the torso, the arms and the legs to give me an understanding of which direction they're bending in, and that'll get me on my way to the second step here. This next part is where the meat comes in of this exercise. This is where we now start to learn everything we can about the pose. If you don't have a model readily available, somebody who can stand in front of you or pose in front of you, then you have to use a photograph or you have to use some point of reference. And in this case, the photo gives me one point of view, but that's all it gives me. It doesn't give me any more than that. And I can search anywhere on the internet and try to find that point of reference, and more than likely I won't find it anywhere at all. And so what that kind of means is that I'm stuck. And I can either, 1, go after what's out there and available, or 2, take my chances anyway and just go for it. And by going for it, it does mean I need to know something about the body. So what I'm doing here in this first drawing is I'm finding the easiest pose within the entire 3 view, or ortho view of the drawing. An ortho view is taking it out of deep space perspective, so to speak, in terms of it projecting back in space and tapering, kind of like 2 lines that run parallel with each other like a pathway. Eventually they look like they converge way off in space, even though they don't. And that is linear perspective. In this case, we're taking the linear perspective part out of it, and we're working purely with orthograph perspective. Orthograph perspective, or isometric perspective, keeps things in perspective in its own space, but it does not relate it to a horizon line in any way. So there's no vanishing points and no recession of form. I'm starting with the easiest view to design from, which would be front or back. In this case, I'm going with the front. Squaring up the shoulders as much as possible to that forward view, or at least putting the torso in what would be close to absolute forward perspective to the camera. And then the pitch in the correct direction that the pose is taking. So basically I'm just flattening out one view of the pose. That way I have a starting point. And then from that I have to understand the receding forms. So the pelvis is obviously being overlapped by the rib cage, and then the legs are falling back even further than that into space. So the head would be the closest thing to our view, and the feet would be the furthest thing back. And then, like I did with the first drawing, I'm looking for the map of the pose, the cross contours, the lines that go up and over the form, across the form, that help me recognize the difference between the left side and the right side, the balance between the two sides. And that goes with everything on the body, the elbows, the shoulders, the two sides of the head, the hips, the rib cage, the knees, the ankles, the feet, all of it. Once the first view is done, then the other two views are actually easier to do because we already have a context clue. We have the first drawing finished. So what I'm doing, and why I'm drawing all of this on graph paper, is that it makes it really simple for me to draw a line across the page and recognize its elevation, and if it changes very quickly, because it will default to a different box or a different graph space on the page. So this helps me keep everything aligned, but this is the way we do an ortho view. We transfer lines from one drawing to the next, carrying the information over, transferring it from one view to another. And if you get the first view right, you have all the transfer information that you need for the other two views. So I'm working my way up the body now, a little bit at a time. I'm using a ruler when needed to help me get the information that's further away from the first drawing lined up. Whatever tools it takes, because remember, you're trying to memorize something. So if it requires every tool in your toolbox to make it so, to memorize the information, then by all means use every tool. Because the more you are aware of everything going on in the pose, the easier it's going to be for you to draw this pose from any angle. So now I'm on the third view, which is the back view. I did a front view, a side view, and now a back view. That would be a standard ortho. If we were to actually build this as a 3D object, we would have a front, a side, and a top view most of the time. But in this case, because this is an organic form, we're looking at it from front, back, and side view. The top and the bottom view will be a given, and if we even draw a picture with that particular angle in mind. So now all the information is in reverse, and I have to stay aware of the tumbling forms and to which side I'm drawing so that I don't end up drawing the wrong information on the wrong side. I'm trying to match the left arm up, the right arm up, the left leg, the right leg, etc. Looking for all the information, though, again, is very easy because it's a transfer over of the information. We don't have any height to worry about. That's already been resolved. The only thing we're concerned with now is the deep space depth and how the shapes overlap each other as they go from forward to backward. And that's the hardest view in any drawing because the piece of paper doesn't have dimension to it. We're adding that dimension as we go. But having these cross contours and having this 3 view now is going to be extremely valuable because this is the information that's going to help me take it to the next step and draw this pose from any angle for the illustration or the picture that I need to draw this with. Now here are all 3 views kind of lined up. We can kind of see everything paired up. And here's the final product. I did one more plate and cleaned up the drawings here. So now we get to the final drawing. And in this final drawing, I'm doing a top-down view. I'm drawing it as if we were maybe in Red Bull position, where I have the camera right up above the athlete. And I'm also going to change the scenario. He's not going to be jumping from a wall to the ground. He's going to be jumping from one building to another. So that's what an illustrator will do. An illustrator will take something and will create their own event. regardless of whether or not it was a real event or it was a made-up event. And that's what I'm doing here. So I'm ghosting in the pose. I'm lightly laying in the pose in the position that I think it needs to be put in, so that I can then start to tool around with it. And I'm using all of the same information that I had before. I'm using all the same body parts and the same angles. I'm just now kind of realizing it from a different point of view. So that just basically means that in my mind, I've rotated all of those shapes into a different position, and I'm looking for the same pose, but within that new position. And then here I am putting in the background, laying in all of the architectural lines for the buildings, the geometry that the character is passing over, the ground plane. Looking at the street, and I'm putting boxes in where cars would go, and basically just articulating the space, putting together all of the elements. Once the mannequin has been posed, then I can go ahead and start articulating a little bit more. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm looking for muscle rhythms now. These rhythms are going to be important for the clothing and the shading as I put that information into the picture. So I'm looking also at the geometry of the figures so that I can see the 3D of it, not just the wireframe, but how the figure feels in 3D form or 3D space. That's why the shading is necessary here, so that I can see both sides. And I've added a couple figures over to the other side to create a reason why this guy had to jump from one building to the next. He was being pursued by these other two figures who are now both precariously balanced on the edge of the building as this guy leaps from one over to the other. And finally, because I have the pose laid in, I can look at it now and see that one part of the dynamic needs to change a little bit, and I'm rotating this arm to put it in a stronger position. And here is the final drawing as we see it in the chart. So the only thing left for us to do now is finish the picture. We take the layer below, the chart that we've drawn for ourselves, and we use that as a roadmap to put all the detail on top of. And I would not call this drawing a detailed drawing. This is just a line drawing. This is setting up where the details will be shaded. A detail is nothing more than a smaller shape. So I'm using that word, though, because we all know it in context to putting little things into the picture. And that's what this step might feel like. But it's actually just articulating more information that has not yet been placed into the picture. So like right now, what I'm doing is I'm looking for the rhythm lines of how all of the folds will traverse over the body. And I'm looking for them in a pattern. How do they relate to each other? How do they relate to the gravity of the pose? And I'm putting them in, designing them to the best of my ability. And I am using the reference to help me deduce how many folds to put in there. I'm taking liberties, of course, and I'm only putting in so many that is required of me here so that I can get a good picture out of it. If I try to copy every single nuance and detail, I might have another convoluted picture, and it's up to me to edit out what isn't necessary so that I can get the strongest image possible out of all the information that I am putting into it. So you'll notice that the tops and the top of the legs, the top of the thighs and the shins, the clothing is flush, while on the underside it's billowing. That is going with the laws of physics. As they're whipping around, the material's pressing against the legs and pushing off from the backside, while the shirt now is toppling downward because the character is now halfway around in his flip. And so because he is now going into an upside down pose, anything loose is going to drop with gravity. And that's what I'm taking into consideration. Then any other line that I can find to help me create a convincing overlap is going to be helpful as well. So the treads of the shoes, the shoelaces, any small nuances that I haven't picked up upon yet, I'm going to try and put in there and push the drawing as far as I can into that believable realm. With all of this set up, it's going to make it that much easier for me to finish it, regardless of what kind of finish I'm going to use, which means whichever technique I'm going to finish it off with. So this does conclude the drawing. This is as far as I'm going to take it. And this is the way that you would invent a picture using some kind of photo reference.